I walked into the bridal suite on my wedding morning and found Helen, my beautiful bride, sobbing into her hands. The elegant ivory gown we'd chosen together 3 months ago was gone. In its place hung the most hideous thing I'd ever seen. A yellowed, moth-eaten dress that looked like it had been pulled from a dumpster behind a thrift store. Chelsea, Helen's daughter, stood in the corner examining her nails. "It's vintage," she said with a shrug. "Much more appropriate for a woman her age." What Chelsea didn't know was that her cruel little swap had just cost her $200,000 and handed me the weapon I needed to destroy her completely. Before I tell you how a piece of thrift store trash became the key to taking down the most manipulative person I'd ever met, hit that like button and subscribe. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Now let me take you back to that morning when everything changed. My name is Walt Harrison. I'm 64 years old, a widower for the past 8 years, and until that Saturday morning, I thought I was just a simple man getting a second chance at happiness. Helen was 52, kind, gentle, and nothing like my late wife, except in the ways that mattered. She made me laugh. She listened when I talked about my woodworking projects. She didn't mind that I was retired on a modest pension and lived in a small house on the edge of town. We'd met at a grief support group 2 years ago, and slowly, carefully, built something real. The wedding was supposed to be small and dignified. Just family and close friends at the little church Helen had attended for 30 years. I'd been looking forward to it for months. But when I walked into that bridal suite to check on her before the ceremony, I found her sitting on a folding chair in her slip, crying so hard she could barely breathe. The beautiful gown we'd picked out together, the one that had cost me 3 months of careful saving, was nowhere to be seen. Instead, hanging on the door was something that looked like it belonged in a Halloween costume store. "Where's your dress?" I asked, already knowing something was terribly wrong. Helen couldn't even answer. She just pointed at the hideous yellowed thing hanging there. It was old, stained, with lace that was falling apart and a hem that dragged on the floor. It smelled like mothballs and dust. Chelsea stepped forward, her arms crossed, wearing a smug expression I was starting to recognize. "There was a mix-up with the cleaners," she said flatly. "This was all they had available on short notice. Mom will just have to make do. The church is packed. We can't delay now." I looked at Helen, at the mascara running down her face, at the defeat in her eyes. "We can postpone," I said gently. "We can reschedule for next week, when we get the right dress." Chelsea laughed. Actually laughed. "And waste everyone's time? All those people drove here. The caterer is set up, the photographer is waiting. No, she needs to put on the dress and get out there. It's just one day. Nobody will care what she's wearing." Helen looked up at me with such pain in her eyes. "Walt, I can't go out there in this. They'll laugh at me." They did laugh at her. Not loudly, not cruelly, but I saw it. The whispers behind hands, the barely concealed smirks, the pitying glances. My brother Timothy leaned over during the processional and whispered, "She looks like she stepped out of a Goodwill dumpster." "What happened?" I didn't answer. I was too busy watching Helen walk down that aisle in a dress that hung wrong, dragged on the carpet, and made her look 20 years older than she was. And I was watching Chelsea in the front row, sitting there with that satisfied little smile, knowing exactly what she'd done. The ceremony was a blur. Helen barely spoke above a whisper when she said her vows. The photographer tried his best to position us so the dress looked less terrible, but there was only so much he could do. At the reception, people were kind to our faces, but I heard the comments. I heard them call her, "that poor woman," and wonder what had happened. My own son Aaron pulled me aside after the cake cutting. "Dad, we need to talk," he said urgently. "Are you sure about this? You're marrying into a nest of snakes." I tried to defend Helen, to explain that she was nothing like her daughter, but Aaron shook his head. "I've been watching Chelsea all day. She's enjoying this. She wanted Mom humiliated. Why would you tie yourself to that family?" Before I could answer, Chelsea stood up to give a toast. She raised her glass with that same smug smile and spoke about second-hand love stories and how some people get there happily ever after the second time around, even if it comes with a few compromises on the dream. The room went uncomfortably silent. Helen's face flushed red with embarrassment. I was about to stand up and say something when Helen suddenly stood, mumbled an excuse about needing air, and practically ran out of the reception hall, still wearing that awful dress. I found her 20 minutes later in the church parking lot, sitting in our car. But something had changed. She wasn't crying anymore. She was staring at something in her hands with an expression I couldn't read. "Walt," she said quietly, "come look at this." I climbed into the passenger seat. In her lap was a small velvet pouch, old and worn, with a drawstring pulled tight. "Where did you find that?" I asked. "It was sewn into the lining of the dress," Helen said, her voice shaking slightly. "I felt it when I sat down at the reception. There was a loose seam near the waist and something hard inside. I tore it open in the bathroom." She opened the pouch. Inside were three things. First, a handful of loose diamonds, clear and brilliant, even in the dim parking lot light. Second, yellowed appraisal papers dated 1980 from a jeweler in Philadelphia. And third, a small note card in careful handwriting that read, "For the one who sees past appearances, Eleanor B." My heart stopped. I knew that name. I knew that handwriting. "Eleanor," I whispered. Helen looked at me sharply. "You know who this is?" I took the note card with trembling hands. "Eleanor Brennan. She was my aunt, my father's younger sister. We were estranged for decades after a family fight about my father's will. She died 5 years ago. I didn't even go to the funeral." I looked at the diamonds again, at the appraisal papers showing a value of $200,000 even back in 1980. "Helen, this is impossible. How would Eleanor's jewelry end up in a random thrift store dress?" Helen shook her head slowly. "Walt, I don't think this was random at all." We sat in that car for another hour, turning over the pieces. The appraisal papers listed the diamonds as family heirlooms from Eleanor's mother's side, some dating back to the 1920s. The note was clearly meant for someone, but who? And why hide it in a thrift store dress? Helen wanted to find the rightful owner immediately. "We can't keep this," she said firmly. "These belong to your aunt. There must be other family members who should have them." I agreed, but something felt wrong about the whole situation. "Let's think this through," I said carefully. "Why would a $200,000 heirloom be hidden in a dress at a thrift store? That doesn't make sense unless..." I trailed off, a thought forming. "Unless what?" Helen asked. "Unless someone put it there deliberately," I said slowly. "Unless this was meant to be found exactly this way." The next morning, still exhausted from the wedding, I drove to the thrift store where Chelsea claimed the dress had come from. The building was dark. A sign on the door read, "Permanently closed, thank you for 30 years." A neighbor watering her flowers told me the owner had retired and moved to Florida 2 months ago. Dead end, or so I thought. I spent the next 3 days tracking down anyone connected to that thrift store. Finally, I found a name in old business records, a seamstress named Florence who'd done alterations there for 20 years before it closed. She lived in a small apartment on the other side of town. When I knocked on her door and explained who I was, her eyes lit up with recognition. "Oh, the wedding dress," she said immediately. "I remember that one very well. It came in with another dress, both donated by the same young woman. Very well dressed, very rude, very impatient." My pulse quickened. "Can you describe her?" Florence nodded, walking to her cluttered sewing room. She pulled out a photo album where she kept pictures of particularly interesting pieces she'd worked on. I took photos because the other dress was so beautiful. Designer label, probably worth thousands. "See?" She showed me a picture. There in the photo, dropping off 2 garment bags, was Chelsea. Clear as day. I felt my blood pressure rising but kept my voice calm. "Do you remember what she said when she dropped them off?" Florence thought for a moment. She said she was cleaning out her mother's closet, getting rid of old things her mother didn't need anymore. Very cold about it. I thanked Florence and left, my mind racing. Chelsea had donated both dresses. The beautiful one Helen was supposed to wear, and this yellowed vintage one. But somewhere in the process, the wrong dress had been pulled for the wedding. The dress with Eleanor's diamonds hidden inside. Chelsea had accidentally given away $200,000. I sat in my car and started laughing. I couldn't help it. Chelsea, in her cruelty, in her desire to humiliate her own mother, had made the most expensive mistake of her life. And she had no idea. But I needed to understand why Eleanor's diamonds were in that dress in the first place. I called my lawyer, an old friend named Harold who'd helped me with my late wife's estate. Harold, I need you to pull everything you can find about Eleanor Brennan's will and estate, anything filed in the last 10 years. He called me back that afternoon. Walt, this is interesting. Your aunt's will had some unusual provisions. The bulk of her estate, about $1.2 million, was left to you as her closest living relative. But there was a condition. The inheritance would only transfer if you proved yourself worthy of it within 5 years of her death. Worthy how? I asked, already suspecting the answer. Harold read from the document. The will states that the inheritance will transfer to Walt Harrison if he demonstrates the ability to recognize character over appearances, compassion over cruelty, and truth over convenience. If he fails this test, or if a direct descendant attempts to manipulate access to the estate through marriage or fraud, the entire amount goes to charity. I sat back in my chair, stunned. Eleanor had set up a test, and somehow, 5 years later, it was still playing out. Harold, there's something else you should know. Chelsea, my stepdaughter, she tried to get close to Eleanor before she died, didn't she? Harold was quiet for a moment. How did you know that? Just a guess. Harold sighed. Yes, according to the estate lawyer's notes, a young woman claiming to be engaged to Eleanor's nephew tried to visit Eleanor multiple times in her final year. Eleanor refused to see her and made notes in her file that this woman was manipulative and dangerous. She actually amended her will because of it, adding that clause about manipulation through marriage. Chelsea had tried to charm Eleanor for inheritance money and failed. Now she was married into my family, thinking she could control Helen and by extension, control me. She had no idea that the dress swap had just handed me proof of her character. Over the next week, I started digging deeper into Chelsea's past. What I found disturbed me. She'd had 3 serious relationships before her current marriage. In each one, there were accusations of financial manipulation. Her first boyfriend claimed she'd forged checks using his account, never prosecuted because he didn't want the embarrassment. Her second partner discovered she'd opened credit cards in their joint name without permission. Again, settled quietly to avoid scandal. Her ex-husband's divorce filing mentioned financial abuse and control. The pattern was clear. Chelsea was a con artist who targeted people emotionally while bleeding them financially. And her current victim was her own mother. I found bank statements Helen had left on our kitchen counter. She'd been paying off Chelsea's credit card bills for 2 years, thousands of dollars every month. When I asked Helen about it, she looked embarrassed. Chelsea had some hard times, she explained weakly. She needed help getting back on her feet. I didn't push it then. I was building a case, gathering evidence. But the proof I needed came 2 weeks after our wedding when Helen got a fraud alert on her phone. Someone had applied for a personal loan using her name and social security number. $50,000. Helen stared at the alert in confusion. I didn't apply for any loan. This must be a mistake. She called the bank immediately. The representative confirmed an application had been submitted online that morning, complete with Helen's personal information and digital signature. This is fraud, Helen said, her voice shaking. I need to report this. Before she could finish, Chelsea called. She'd been listening on another line somehow, or maybe the bank had contacted her as the emergency contact. Mom, don't panic, Chelsea said smoothly. You must have forgotten. Remember last week when we talked about consolidating your debt? I helped you fill out the application. You were confused, but you signed everything. Helen looked uncertain. I don't remember that. Of course you don't, Chelsea said, her voice dripping with fake concern. That's why I'm helping you. You're getting older, Mom. It's normal to forget these things. I watched Helen's face crumple with self-doubt. This was Chelsea's strategy. Gaslight her mother until she questioned her own memory. But I'd heard enough. I took the phone from Helen gently. Chelsea, this is Walt. We're going to the bank in person to review this application. We'll get to the bottom of it. I hung up before she could respond. At the bank, I asked to speak with the manager privately. The bank manager was a professional woman who took the fraud claim seriously. We can review our security footage, she offered. The online application was submitted, But we also have records of IP addresses and device information. She pulled up the logs. The application had come from a computer at a coffee shop 3 blocks from Chelsea's house. But more importantly, someone had come into the branch 2 days earlier to verify identity documents. "Can we see that footage?" I asked. The manager queued up the video. There on screen was Chelsea, wearing a wig and sunglasses, presenting a driver's license and forging Helen's signature on verification paperwork. It was clear as day. Helen gasped. "That's my daughter." The manager's face hardened. "This is identity theft and fraud. We'll need to file a police report." I put my hand on Helen's arm. "Not yet. I need a copy of this footage first." The manager looked uncertain, but eventually agreed to provide me with a digital copy for our records. "However, we are required to report suspected fraud," she warned. I nodded. "Give us 48 hours, then do what you need to do." We left the bank with the evidence secured on a flash drive. But I didn't confront Chelsea. Not yet. I had a better plan forming. Over the next month, I played the fool perfectly. I let Chelsea think I was just a simple old man who'd gotten lucky marrying her mother. When she talked down to me at family dinners, I smiled and nodded. When she made comments about my modest house and old truck, I agreed that yes, I wasn't much of a provider. When she suggested I should sign some documents, giving her power of attorney, in case something happens to you, Walt, at your age, I pretended to consider it seriously. All the while, I was working with Harold to restructure everything. We created a trust that protected my assets and Eleanor's pending inheritance. We documented every interaction with Chelsea, every manipulation, every lie, and we updated my will with very specific language that would prevent Chelsea from ever seeing a penny, even through Helen. Harold reviewed the security footage from the bank and whistled. "This is enough to put her away for fraud. Why aren't you pressing charges?" "Because I want her to hang herself completely," I said. "If we arrest her now, she'll claim it was a misunderstanding, hire a good lawyer, maybe get probation. I want her to show everyone exactly who she is, with no room for doubt." 2 weeks later, Chelsea organized a family dinner at her house. It was supposed to be a celebration of her new promotion at work. The dinner was awkward from the start. Chelsea's husband, a quiet man who clearly lived in fear of her, barely spoke. My son Aaron was there, watching everything with suspicious eyes. And Chelsea held court like a queen, making subtle digs at everyone. She criticized Helen's outfit. She made jokes about my age. She compared her expensive renovated kitchen to our quaint little house. Every comment was designed to diminish and demean. Helen took it silently, her face growing paler as the evening went on. Finally, during dessert, Chelsea made a comment that broke something in Helen. "You know, Mom, you should really consider moving in with Walt permanently. That way we can sell your house and put the money toward your future care. You're not getting any younger, and memory issues run in the family." It was cruel and calculated. Helen set down her fork carefully. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but steady. "You forged my signature to try to steal $50,000 from me. You've been draining my accounts for years. You switched my wedding dress to humiliate me, and now you want my house?" Chelsea's face went white, then red. "I don't know what lies Walt has been telling you, but—" "He showed me the bank footage," Helen interrupted. "I saw you, in a wig, forging my signature." The room went silent. Chelsea's husband stared at his plate. Aaron sat back with his arms crossed, watching. Chelsea recovered quickly, her voice turning sharp and defensive. "That footage doesn't prove anything. I was helping you, and you're too confused to remember. This is elder abuse, Walt turning you against your own daughter." Helen stood up slowly. "You're not my daughter anymore. Not in any way that matters. A daughter doesn't steal from her mother. A daughter doesn't try to make her mother look foolish on her wedding day. Get out of my life, Chelsea." She walked out of the house. I followed her, leaving Chelsea's sputtering threats behind us. A week later, the lawsuit arrived. Chelsea was suing us for ownership of the diamonds. Her claim was simple. The dress had been hers, donated by mistake with family jewelry accidentally left inside. She wanted the stones returned immediately or their appraised value paid in cash. The lawsuit was filed in county court with a hearing date set for 6 weeks out. I called Harold. "She's walking right into it," he said. "This is exactly what we needed." We have the seamstress testimony, we have the bank footage, we have everything. Good, I said. Let's make sure the judge sees all of it. The courtroom was small but packed. Chelsea arrived with an expensive lawyer, dressed in a designer suit, playing the role of the wronged victim. Helen sat beside me, nervous but determined. I'd asked Harold to let me handle most of the questioning. I wanted to watch Chelsea dig her own grave. The judge, an older woman with sharp eyes, called the case. Chelsea's lawyer went first, arguing that his client had accidentally donated a dress containing valuable family jewelry, and that the defendants were refusing to return property that legally belonged to her. These are family heirlooms, the lawyer said smoothly, worth over $200,000. My client made an honest mistake during a difficult time, and now her own mother is trying to profit from it. The judge looked at us. Response? Harold stood. Your Honor, we have evidence that fundamentally contradicts the plaintiff's claims about this being an honest mistake. He presented the seamstress testimony first. Florence had agreed to testify, and she was compelling. She described Chelsea's attitude, her coldness, her specific statement about getting rid of old things her mother didn't need. Then Harold played the bank security footage. The courtroom watched Chelsea commit identity fraud in real time. The judge's expression darkened with each passing second. Chelsea's lawyer tried to object, claiming the bank footage was irrelevant to the diamond dispute. Your Honor, what my client may or may not have done regarding a loan application has no bearing on the ownership of family jewelry. The judge cut him off. It absolutely has bearing on her credibility and her pattern of behavior. Continue. Harold then presented documentation showing the diamonds had belonged to Eleanor Brennan, my aunt, not anyone in Chelsea's family. The appraisal papers, the note, Eleanor's will with its specific conditions. The jewelry was hidden intentionally, Harold explained, as a test. A test that the plaintiff failed spectacularly by attempting to humiliate her own mother on her wedding day. The judge reviewed everything in silence for several long minutes. When she finally spoke, her voice was ice cold. Miss Chelsea, I find your testimony completely lacking in credibility. The evidence shows a pattern of deception, manipulation, and fraud. Not only are your claims to the diamonds dismissed, but I'm referring this case to the district attorney for prosecution on the bank fraud charges. Chelsea went pale. Her lawyer tried to intervene, but the judge wasn't finished. Furthermore, I'm ordering you to repay your mother all funds fraudulently obtained over the past 3 years, with interest, and you're forbidden from contacting her directly for any reason. The gavel came down with finality. Chelsea sat frozen in shock, while her lawyer gathered papers with shaking hands. As we left the courtroom, I heard her screaming at her attorney in the hallway. But I didn't press charges for the fraud. Not right away. I wanted to see how far she'd fall on her own. 2 weeks later, Harold called with news. Walt, I found something. Eleanor left another note, sealed separately in her estate documents. It was only to be opened after legal proceedings involving the diamonds were resolved. What does it say? I asked. Harold read it to me. To Walt Harrison. If you're reading this, you've proven yourself. The woman who sees past appearances has found the treasure hidden in rags. This was always the test. I knew Chelsea would try to hurt anyone close to you. I knew she would reveal herself. The diamonds are yours, but more importantly, so is the full inheritance. $1.2 million, plus the property in Philadelphia. Use it to build a life with someone who deserves it. Burn this letter and never tell Chelsea what she could have had. Let her live with what she chose. Eleanor. I sat in Harold's office, stunned. Eleanor had orchestrated everything from beyond the grave. She'd known Chelsea would try to manipulate her way into the family. She'd known Helen would end up humiliated. She'd hidden the diamonds as both a reward and a trap. There's more, Harold said quietly. I did some research into Eleanor's history. She met Helen about 6 years ago at a charity event. They talked for hours. Eleanor wrote in her journal that Helen was the most genuine person she'd met in decades. I looked up sharply. Eleanor knew Helen? She did, and when she heard Helen's daughter was causing problems, trying to control her life, Eleanor started planning. The dress was intentionally placed where Chelsea would find it during one of her raids on Helen's belongings. Eleanor knew Chelsea would use it as a weapon, she just didn't know when. I started laughing. I couldn't help it. Eleanor had played the longest game imaginable. She died 5 years ago, but her plan was still unfolding perfectly. "So the full inheritance?" I asked. Harold smiled. "It's yours. The conditions have been met. You recognized character over appearances. You married Helen despite her daughter's attempts to destroy you. The money will be transferred within 30 days. I thought about all the years of being careful with money, of living modestly, of thinking I'd never have security. And now this. 3 weeks later, Chelsea showed up at our door. She looked terrible, disheveled, thin, with dark circles under her eyes. Her husband had left her. Her job had fired her after the fraud charges became public. She was facing criminal prosecution and had nowhere to turn. Helen answered the door and just stared at her. "Mom, please," Chelsea begged. "I made mistakes. I know that now. But I'm your daughter. You can't just abandon me. I need help. I need money for a lawyer. I need somewhere to stay." Helen looked at me. I could see the conflict in her eyes. Years of being a mother, of protecting and providing, warring with the knowledge of what Chelsea had done. "Should we help her?" Helen asked me quietly. I looked at Chelsea, at this woman who'd tried to destroy us at every turn, who'd humiliated Helen on our wedding day, who'd stolen and lied and manipulated, and I smiled, cold and certain. She made her choices, Helen. She chose cruelty over kindness. She chose greed over love. She chose to hurt the people who would have helped her. Now she gets to live with those choices. Helen took a deep breath and nodded. She turned back to Chelsea. "I'll pay for a public defender, that's all. Figure out the rest yourself." She closed the door gently but firmly. A week later, I made one final visit to Chelsea. She was staying in a cheap motel, barely scraping by. When she opened the door and saw me, her face twisted with hatred. "Come to gloat?" she spat. "No," I said calmly. "I came to offer you a choice." I explained her situation, clearly. The fraud charges would likely result in jail time. Her credit was destroyed. She had no job prospects. She was squatting in her ex-husband's house because she had nowhere else to go. "But I can make this easier," I said. "Sign over the house to me. It's in foreclosure anyway. You're going to lose it regardless. Sign it over voluntarily, and I'll talk to the prosecutor about a reduced sentence. Probation instead of jail time." Chelsea's eyes narrowed. "Why would you help me?" "I'm not helping you," I corrected. "I'm giving you a way to minimize the damage you've done to yourself. Take it or don't. You have 24 hours to decide." She signed the papers the next morning. 2 days later, Helen and I finalized the purchase of the house for the amount owed on the mortgage. It was far below market value, but we'd earned it. We immediately put it back on the market and sold it for a substantial profit. Every dollar went to a battered women's shelter downtown, donated in Eleanor Brennan's name. With Eleanor's inheritance finally transferred, Helen and I had more money than we'd ever imagined having. We paid off both our houses, set up college funds for my grandchildren, and invested the rest carefully. We didn't change who we were. We still lived modestly, still drove old vehicles, still shopped at the same stores. But we had security. We had peace. Chelsea, meanwhile, received probation, but was banned from any financial work. She took a minimum wage job at a grocery store, living in a tiny apartment she could barely afford. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she blamed everyone but herself for her situation. Then, 8 months after everything settled, I got notification of another lawsuit. Chelsea was suing us again, this time for emotional damages caused by our manipulation and elder abuse of her mother. The claim was so ridiculous that Harold actually laughed when he read it. "She's desperate," he said, "and she's making it worse." The lawsuit was dismissed within a week. The judge who reviewed it was the same one from the original case. She not only threw it out, but issued an order banning Chelsea from filing any further frivolous suits against us. "Miss Chelsea," the judge wrote in her order, "your pattern of behavior demonstrates that you use the legal system to harass and intimidate. Any future filings will result in sanctions." Chelsea's attempt to sue backfired in another way. Her new boyfriend, someone she'd started dating after her divorce, turned out to be running his own con. He'd befriended her specifically to access her mother's money, not knowing there wasn't any left. When he realized Chelsea was broke and toxic, he leaked all her emails and text messages to a local news blog. The messages revealed everything: her plans to manipulate Helen, her schemes to access my inheritance, her lies about the dress, all of it. The story went viral in our small town. Chelsea became infamous as the woman who tried to steal from her own mother on her wedding day. She was humiliated in a way I could never have orchestrated myself. She destroyed her own reputation through her own choices and her own desperation. People who'd once known her crossed the street to avoid her. Her remaining friends vanished. She was completely alone, and I felt nothing but a distant sadness for what she could have been if she'd chosen differently. Our first anniversary arrived. I'd been planning a surprise for Helen for months. I'd tracked down the original wedding dress through the thrift store records, paid a professional restoration service to repair and clean it, and had it waiting for her. On our anniversary evening, I presented Helen with a large white box. She opened it carefully and gasped. Inside was the dress she was supposed to wear on our wedding day, restored to its original beauty. The ivory fabric gleamed. The delicate beadwork had been repaired. It looked like something from a fairy tale. "Walt," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "How did you?" "We deserve a proper memory," I said. "Put it on." That night, we held a small ceremony in our backyard with just close friends and family. My son Aaron walked Helen down the makeshift aisle. She wore the restored dress and the diamond necklace we'd had made from Eleanor's stones. She looked absolutely radiant. After we renewed our vows, we hosted a dinner for 20 people in our small house. Among the guests were several of Eleanor's old friends, people who'd known her well and who'd agreed to come celebrate the woman who'd orchestrated this strange, beautiful justice. One of them, an elderly woman named Florence, who'd been Eleanor's college roommate, stood to make a toast. Eleanor always said that the measure of a person isn't what they claim to be, it's what they do when no one's watching. Walt and Helen, you've proven yourselves to be exactly the kind of people Eleanor hoped you'd be. Now, a year and a half after that awful wedding day, I sit in my workshop thinking about everything that happened. People ask me sometimes if I feel guilty about how things turned out for Chelsea. They ask if I took revenge too far, if I was cruel. But here's the truth. I didn't destroy Chelsea. I simply gave her enough rope and watched her hang herself. Every bad thing that happened to her was the direct result of her own choices. She chose to humiliate her mother. She chose to commit fraud. She chose to steal and lie and manipulate. I just made sure the consequences caught up with her. The dress switch that was meant to be the ultimate humiliation became the test that proved Helen's character and my own. The 200,000 in hidden diamonds was Eleanor's final gift. Her way of ensuring that goodness was rewarded and cruelty was exposed. And Chelsea? She called me a fool for years. She thought I was just a simple old man she could manipulate and control. In the end, I didn't need to destroy her. I just needed to give her the shovel and let her dig her own grave. That's the funny thing about revenge. Sometimes the sweetest kind isn't the revenge you take. It's the revenge people take on themselves when you simply refuse to save them from their own nature. If this story meant something to you, hit that like button and subscribe. Tell me in the comments, have you ever watched someone destroy themselves through their own cruelty? Thanks for watching.